Welcome to Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton, where we equip pastors to take their churches from declining to thriving by pointing them to a new future and a new hope. Join us weekly for encouragement and practical advice in your pastoring journey. So here we are again with Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton, and we are talking about ways that we can help your ministry, help you accomplish what it is that you believe God wants to accomplish in and through your ministry. There are obviously roadblocks along the way, and there are questions that you just don't seem to have some answers for, and we hope to find those answers and help you out. My name is Dan Hurst, and let me take a real quick moment just to remind you that we need you to, subscribe to the podcast as we grow our audience. Those folks that listen to us, that's really important to us, and so it just takes a real easy, quick minute. You just poke on the button right there and click on the button, and you can become part of our subscriber family. It doesn't cost you anything. We don't pester you with it. It's just for our own ego.
So, you get to be part of the cool kids club and sit at the cool table at lunch.
That's true. You can tell people, hey, I'm a subscriber.
I'm a subscriber to Revitalize and Replant.
Today we're going to talk about 4 steps you can take when your family isn't happy at church.
Oh, now, that's a good one, Dan.
That is a sensitive topic.
That's a good one. And we're here with Mark Halleck. He's joining us. Mark's a family man. His family's been involved in ministry here at Calvary Church for all these 14 years.
Yes.
Since he's been here, replanting this church. We're actually physically at Calvary right now in
here.
Denver doing this podcast from the sub-basement of Calvary.
Some weird room somewhere in this church. We are here.
With the most uncomfortable couch I've ever
It's not comfortable. It's not pretty either.
It's not pretty nor comfortable.
But dude, we're together.
And it's not and it's not clean either. So it's the trifecta.
Don't look too close. Yep.
I know. But anyway, we are going to talk about what to do when your family is not happy in your church.
Now, there are 5 things that we want to talk about. We said 4 things. There are actually 5 things that because we're adding one to, it'll be a little surprise for you.
Okay.
But as we were setting this up, you made mention of you said this. I'm quoting you exactly. Don't undersell church.
I did. A lot of times when guys are going to a church in need of revitalization, particularly any church as a pastor, but if you're going in church that's in need of revitalization, do not undersell it to your family in order to get them to come along with you. Don't tell them it's going to be easier than it really is. In fact, let them know this is going to be incredibly hard, and then it's going to get harder. Then it's really going to get hard, and then it's going to become almost unbearable. Now, you can, think...
You have the gift of encouragement,
I know.
don't you?
But the reality is we're going into a spiritual warfare in this place, and the adversary's not going to give us a pass. And so he's going to attack our marriage, our finances, perhaps our health, our children. We need to know what we're getting into when we go into this.
That's right.
And so they need to have the right expectations. So many times I'll hear a pastor, and he'll tell me my wife and my kids are just unhappy, and they didn't know what they were getting into. They thought they were going to this church that really wanted to change and really wanted to be something different. And maybe you thought that too as the pastor, but trust me, even though they say we want to change, until the change starts happening, they don't know the cost of change. And they're going to push back on you. Yeah. And so you need to let your family know before you go, this is ministry. There's spiritual warfare involved. This is not going to be easy. It may be the richest, most blessing time we ever have as a family.
Yep.
It may be the most rewarding thing we ever do, but it may also be the hardest thing.
And I'll tell you and if you approach it that way, what a discipleship opportunity for your family. Because then it's like, this is why, getting your kiddos together, this is why we need to pray together every night.
Absolutely.
We need to pray. We need to seek the Lord. We need to be praying for these folks in this community because God's going to do something, guys.
And then when something bad happens at the church, somebody says something mean, or you go, we told this was spiritual warfare. We're not surprised by that. It's what we expected. We're mainly even shows we're doing the right thing.
Yeah, that's right.
That's what I meant, Hurst. You just need to make sure they understand what's happening to them when they go in, rather than realize your kids and your wife may be a little reluctant to move halfway across the country and go to this dying church, and you try to tell them, it'll be fine, they're going to love it, they're going to be great. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I think it's so important also at the same time to make sure that you're not only telling them the truth, but you're listening to them and what their fears are.
That's good.
To listen to them and allow them to be completely honest with you.
I've had more than one pastor contact me and say, in a very broken-hearted way, a very hopeless way, And maybe some of you men listening to this, and some of you women who are pastors' wives listening to this, and some of you church members can relate to this with your pastors and their wives. I've had a number of pastors tell me, my wife has told me I can go back to that church, but she's never going back. She's not driving on that parking lot one more time. She has had it for a variety of reasons. Maybe somebody's just really been saying some mean things about them. Maybe people have been really harsh on them. For whatever reason, it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon for me to experience times when pastors tell me my wife is done. She's finished with it. I hear that, and that's a tough one. And at that point, what you have to what I would say to you, Pastor, is that's your cue to listen to your wife.
That's right.
Listen to your kid. Your kid may say, your teenager, I'm not going back there. That's your cue, not to shame them, not to run the guilt trip on them, but to sit down and listen to them.
Yes.
And say, tell me what's going on. I really want to know. And you need to be a soft place for them to land. They need to know, listen, they need to know that they are your first ministry.
That's right.
You cannot separate your church and your family. You can't say, well, I got to balance church and family. You'll never be able to balance church and family. Your family is part of your church. Your church is part of your family. Your family is the first members of your church. They're members of your church. You've got to love for them and care for them and shepherd them. And so when they're hurting, you've got to sit down, and first thing you got to do is listen to them.
That's so good. That's so good. Don't take it personally. Don't get defensive. These are times to shepherd their souls. I mean, that is your number one calling. In fact, if you're not caring for the souls of your wife and your kids, you have no business shepherding the flock of God according to the scriptures.
Wow.
So be that dad, be that daddy.
Mm-hmm.
That your kiddos can just come and you can hold them, and when they're hurting, let them cry and speak words of truth to them. Be a tender place. Like you said, I love that. Be a soft place to land.
And when your spouse, your wife comes to you and she says, I've had it with this church and these people and what they're doing, don't interrupt her and say, now, wait a minute, let me remind you. You say, really? And tell me. I really want to hear it. I need to hear it.
That's good.
As your husband, I need to hear how this is hurting you. And don't try to fix it at that moment. Don't try to tell her how to deal with it at that moment.
Yeah, that's right.
She doesn't want you to fix it at that moment. She wants to know that you hear her at that moment.
That's so
So
good.
just listen to her and embrace her and tell her that she is your first ministry and you love her and you will always be there for her. Let her know she has the right to say those things to you, that she's hurting. And I've heard so many wives who feel like they don't have the freedom to tell that to their husband because he'll just turn on and say, well, you're the pastor's wife and, we've got to do this. And that's not the time to do that. It's the time to embrace them, listen to them, be a soft place to land, and let them know that you hear their hurt.
Listen, when we read in the scriptures, we're called to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. That includes our families.
Wow, that's true.
And so we want to rejoice when they rejoice, but we want to weep with them when they weep.
Yeah.
Along with that is the next step, if you will, and that is learn to pray not only for them but with them.
Oh man, isn't that true?
If they're not praying for themselves and for that the circumstance that they're in, they're not going to win. They're never going to get past that. And teaching them spiritually how to pray in this difficult time it makes all the difference in the world.
I've been doing ministry for a long time, 45 years, I think, and I'm at the age now where I don't care what people think. I'm not trying to impress anybody. The only reason I'm around is I just want to help people, and I can't help people if I'm not authentic. So I'm going to tell you the biggest struggle in my life as a pastor has been praying with my family. I can find it easier to pray with deacons' kids sometimes than my own kids. I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that's great. I'm saying the adversary does everything he can do to keep us from doing that.
That's right.
And as I look back on raising my kids, I should have been more intentional about praying with them and for them by name. I mean, we prayed every day. Of course we did. But you know what I mean. I mean really intentionally praying with them, letting them hear me say their name in prayer, letting my wife hear me say her name in prayer. If I could go back and do it over, I would be much more intentional about that, rather than sort of just superficial praying when they get to bed or praying when we get to school, but spending more time really praying for what mattered in their life and hearing them. I remember, that's the one thing, Dan's dad and my dad were roommates in college and very similar in many ways, World War II vets and all that kind of stuff, and they had a lot of similarities, and I know Dan has heard this too from his dad, but the way my dad would pray for me and my sisters, I remember that more than anything else.
Wow.
And he was a great preacher, but I remember him praying for me and for my sisters. And he would often weep when he prayed for me and my sisters. And I just wish I had done more of that. And so I think that's really important. They need to hear you and see you pray. You need to help lead them in prayer. Help them learn how to pray. Teach them to pray.
And let me encourage in this. That's so good, Mark. It's so true. You know, we have a saying around our church that goes like this: lean into the awkward.
Wow, that's good.
Lean into the awkward. So like when it comes to community, people are weird. You're weird. I'm weird. And so it's like, I get it, man. You go to a Bible study and it just feels weird and you want to run for the hills. You know what you do? You lean into the awkward. You trust the Lord, because there's a lot of blessing on the other side of awkward. And I think that's true in this with praying.
Yeah.
As your kids get to become teenagers, especially, it starts getting a little weird.
Yeah.
It feels a little awkward. And you know what you got to do then? You got to trust the Lord and be a leader.
Yeah.
And you need to lead into the awkward. And you go into their bedroom again and you say, I'm going to pray for you. And I know it's a little weird because you're becoming an adult and, you know, you're not just my little baby girl anymore.
Right.
But I'm telling you, if we don't lead them, somebody will lead them somewhere.
Yeah.
And so we need to lead. And I think prayer is where we have to lean into the awkward and be ready to experience great blessing on the other side of awkward as we pray for our wives and our kids.
I think also one of the things, and this really opens up a great door for us in the area of prayer, is when we let them know that we're praying for them and ask them what they want us to pray about.
Man. Absolutely.
You know, because that's how we begin to really understand what's really eating at them, what's really hurting them. And when we do that and they tell us what's wrong, then we can move on to the next step, and that's find ways to heal and find ways to encourage and find ways for them to develop their own ministry and become more involved in what they're doing.
Yeah,
you know, we went to Canada when our boys were middle schoolers, and it seemed like an inappropriate time to pull them up out of their school and their environment in Kansas and move to Quebec, of all places, French-speaking Quebec, where they didn't speak any French. And, you know, at first they were obviously resistant. It was like, yeah, Mom and Dad, you can go to Quebec. We'll stay here with grandparents. Have a good time while you're gone. But if God calls us, he was going to call the whole family. And he did. Our boys, and when we went to Quebec, we did something in Quebec we didn't do in Kansas. We really ministered as an entire family.
Man, I love that.
And it really transformed the family in many ways. To this day, it's a time we look back and go, things really changed, because before that, frankly, it was sort of like, well, Dad's the pastor and this is his job and we go along. But when we went to Canada, we went to Quebec, we went to that culture very different than we all were in it together, right?
Yes.
So there's something about finding ways to involve your family in true ownership of ministry, not just doing what you do and shadowing you and helping you, but they actually find their own place to fulfill ministry in that church.
That's so great. And that's leadership. That's how are you leading your family? I mean, your kiddos, listen, you're going to this church. And I just think I talk to a lot of pastors who aren't intentional about that. They've never really even thought about it.
Okay.
They're thinking, hey, this is my new gig. Like, this is my new job, a new ministry position. And yeah, I need to care for my wife and kids, and we'll figure that out. But this is what my thing is. No, this is our thing. It really is. Now, granted, I'm not saying the church has hired your wife and your kids, but it's a package deal, man. And so you can either lead your kids to embrace a vision that you're excited about. That's what I always want with my kids. I was always like, guys, this is so awesome what God has called us to do. And I want you to be part of this. And so when I would go make visits, and still do, when they were little, I'd bring them along. And so it became this thing. It wasn't weird, not this disconnect between dad and being a pastor and real life. And so I agree. I mean, the encouragement is this is a great discipleship opportunity to get your kids and your family involved in something that's very life-giving, kingdom-minded. I look at my kids now, by God's grace. You know, my daughter is in college and has a passion for missions. And I think she would say, boy, it was a lot of being involved in this little dying church that she began to get a heart for those who were far from Jesus and began interacting together with those who were far from Jesus. And so, again, I just say all that is what an opportunity you have in revitalization to get your family
So
involved.
try to find some way to help your family, even your children, find ownership,
Yes, ownership.
in what's going on at the church. Find some role for them to do that they enjoy,
Amen.
and then reward them for it in a very real sense, no matter what it might be.
That's right. No matter what it is, they're all
Right.
unique.
And you told me about when your church, when you first started replanting here across the street, you would clean the school building.
Yes,
Tell me
yes.
about what you told me at lunch.
Oh man,
about your
yeah,
4-year-old.
it's awesome. So we just have this the middle school in our community is
Yeah.
right across the street.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that we would get involved, especially in the early years when we were just a little church of 30 people, is we would clean the church once a month.
Clean the school.
Clean the school. I'm sorry, clean the school. And we do that as everybody in the church.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember one night, and I see my little boy, who at the time was probably 5 years old, and he's scrubbing a wall with an older gentleman in our church, and they're laughing and they're talking and they're scrubbing, and I'm going, man, that's a picture of intergenerational ministry.
Right.
But more than that, seeds were being planted. My son fell in love with that man
Yeah.
and this church and the church.
You know, as a teenager, a young teenager, 12, 13 years old, my dad's church started a bus ministry back in the 70s, right? Early
that's
everybody
awesome.
else was.
Yeah.
And I never really was involved. And I'd go to Sunday school, I'd go to worship. I never led because I was like 10 or 12 years old. All of a sudden in bus ministry, I get to be in the bus ministry, right? I get to ride the bus and sign the kids on, sign them off. And I end up every Saturday morning, I spend it with Cliff Lynch and Gerald Ruff, these two guys. And they were two deacons, and they came every Saturday morning, and we would go make visits to all the bus route kids. And then every Sunday, we'd get there and start those buses up. I learned all about buses. I learned so much from Gerald and from Cliff. And that's where I cut my teeth
Yes,
on ministry,
yes.
was doing that. I look back at the bus ministry going, I was 12, 13, 14 years old working with those men every week, every Saturday, every Sunday. That's when that church became my church. It became my ministry. And I can't overemphasize enough, if there's a way you can help your children and your spouse find meaningful ministry. Now, if you can't, if the church is so dysfunctional and so broken, and I know some of you went to some places like that, there's really nothing, then we're going to talk about what you can do next.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good.
Which is, of course, and you mentioned this earlier, Mark, that sometimes you need to seek partner churches that can minister to your family
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
help you out.
Yeah, I tell guys call me all the time and say, we're the only children in our church, and it's all older people, and they're unhappy older people. They're mad at me because we're making changes. They don't want us to touch anything. We can't move a silk plant. We can't move a table anywhere. We can't, anything. We're just in a really tough place right now, and I'm going to have to spend 2 or 3 years of just shepherding and missionary work and everything else before we can even get to the place where we can start revitalizing. And right now, my wife's the only young woman there. Our children are the only children there, and it's really hard on them. Here's what you do. You find another Southern Baptist church in your community, and you go to that pastor and you say, I need somebody to help minister to my family. Do you have a Awanas kid or mission friends or RAs or GAs? I want my kids to come to that on your church, to your church on Wednesday nights. Do you have a small group that meets in homes somewhere during the week? My wife and I want to join that small group. Find some other Southern Baptist church that can minister to your wife and your kids other than on Sunday mornings, and let them find some real meaningful ministry there. They need to be cared for and ministered to. So don't overlook that. It's a real possibility that could happen, and it could be. I remember Dr. Rayner, one time he told me that he was at a small sort of struggling church when his boys were young, and they needed some other young people to be around, and so they sent them to another church in town. They got a little criticism from their church for doing that, but looking back, it was the best thing they could do for their boys at that point in time. They really needed that relationship that his church couldn't provide. And I think you've got to look at your family. It's not always the case. You don't just always do that, but that could be an option for you. For sure, especially the small group. If there's a good church that has a small group ministry, and you and your wife can visit and be part of that small group on Thursday nights or Tuesday nights, that can be so beneficial to your wife.
Well, and I would say this, flipping it, if you're sitting here listening and you're in a larger or healthier church,
absolutely.
This is one of the ways you can bless those families in those struggling churches. Invite them in, serve them, look for ways to bless the wife of this pastor and the kiddos. And, what an opportunity to put your arms around a pastor and his family in this little church that's being revitalized.
So go talk to your associational mission strategist, your director of missions, or your state convention leader, and say, hey, our church would like to minister to the family of a pastor who's in a struggling or dying church that has kids. What could we do? Could you hook us up with them? Yeah. And then, invite them to Mission Friends or to RAs or to your youth group. Ask that pastor's wife to be part of your women's group. and be awesome.
The power of partnership, man. We're
Tremendous.
in this together. We're in this together.
So there you have it, 5 steps you can take when your family isn't happy at church and you're looking for ways to bring healing. By the way, there's another side to that, and that is there are people in your church, there are families, young families in your church that are thinking the same thing. How do I get my family to be
That's
happier?
true.
And if you go through that experience, you can help them also. We invite you to subscribe to the podcast. We'll be back here in a few days again with another podcast, and we want you to be a part of it. Let your friends and family know about it, and if you have any questions, be sure and ask. We take those questions, and we look for ways that we can address those things. And we hope to see you again real soon on Revitalize and Replant with Mark Clifton. See you later.
Thanks for joining us today on Revitalize and Replant. This podcast is brought to you by the North American Mission Board, where we help dying or struggling churches regain health for the glory of God and the good of their communities. If you found this conversation helpful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on your favorite platform. To learn more about becoming a replanting pastor or to explore resources about revitalization for your own church, visit churchreplanters.com.